The 1960s and 70s were supposed to be America's automotive glory days, but not every car was a winner. Beneath the muscle and chrome, a wave of poorly built, unreliable, and outdated vehicles began flooding the market. While Detroit clung to old habits, foreign automakers were quietly offering cars that were smaller, smarter, and built to last. Frustrated by breakdowns, recalls, and gas-guzzling giants, American consumers started looking elsewhere. The 1907 Pontiac Phoenix arrived during a critical juncture in American automotive history, a time when the Big Three were scrambling to respond to the growing popularity of small, efficient, and better-built Japanese imports. Meant to replace the aging Ventura and marketed as a more refined, upscale compact car, the Phoenix was named with symbolic ambition, a bird reborn from ashes, rising to glory. Unfortunately, what Pontiac delivered was less a phoenix and more a confused pigeon, and its legacy quickly turned to ash. Built on GM's aging rear-wheel drive X-body platform, first introduced in the early 60s, the Phoenix already had one foot in the past. GM dressed it up with a formal-looking grille, fancier trim, and a more padded interior than the Ventura it replaced, but the fundamentals hadn't changed. Underneath the facelifted skin were the same archaic underpinnings, a cramped chassis, sluggish handling, and suspension geometry better suited to 1967 than 1977. And the build quality? Disappointing even by late 70s domestic standards. Inside, Pontiac tried to sell the Phoenix as an upscale compact, but the results were half-baked. Fake wood-grain dash appliques clashed with brittle plastics, vinyl door cards peeled after a single hot summer, and the seats, often finished in coarse cloth or vinyl, offered minimal support and were prone to splitting. Rattles were common within weeks of ownership. The car felt hastily built, and that's because it was. GM rushed development to keep up with emissions regulations and the federal mandates while trying to outpace the growing threat of the Honda Civic and Toyota Corolla, cars that, by comparison, were quieter, smoother, and significantly more reliable. Under the hood, the Phoenix was saddled with some of GM's most infamous power plants. The base engine was a 151 cubic inch Iron Duke four-cylinder, coarse, noisy, and underpowered even in its day. Optional V6 and small block V8s were available, but emissions tuning and low compression meant these engines were neutered shadows of their former selves. Idle quality was often poor, carburetors were hard to keep in tune, and cold starts were a nightmare. The Phoenix did not purr, it coughed, choked, and hesitated. And then there was the rust. GM cars of the late 70s had a notorious rust problem, and the Phoenix was among the worst offenders. Front fenders bubbled within 2 winters in northern states. Rear quarter panels disintegrated from road salt exposure. Door bottoms and floor pans often corroded to the point of daylight being visible. For a car that was supposed to symbolize rebirth, it decayed like a tomb relic in real time. Worse still, it arrived just as the American public was beginning to realize that there was a world beyond Detroit's factories. Japanese cars, once dismissed as curiosities, had proven to be not only reliable, but downright pleasant to own. Civics, Corollas, and even Datsun B210s started every morning, sipping full, and didn't shake themselves apart on the freeway. The Phoenix, meanwhile, felt like it was falling apart at 20,000 miles. Even customers loyal to Pontiac, and there were still many in the 70s, started to question whether this was what American engineering had come to. Despite Pontiac's hopes, the Phoenix wasn't a commercial or critical success. Sales never hit the expected mark, and early owner surveys often read like lists of grievances. Rough idle, misaligned panels, trim pieces falling off, electrical gremlins, poor gas mileage, and an overall lack of refinement. As competition from foreign automakers heated up, the Phoenix seemed increasingly obsolete with every passing year. Ironically, GM would later attempt to fix the X-body issues with a radical front-wheel drive redesign in 1980, but that led to its own fiasco involving catastrophic braking issues and the infamous X-car recalls. In hindsight, the 1907 Phoenix was just the opening act of a tragedy that played out across the American compact car scene for the next decade. It was a warning sign, an early indicator that the imports were coming fast, and Detroit's answers were looking increasingly out of touch. In the end, the 1977 Pontiac Phoenix wasn't a rebirth. It was a gasping final breath for an outdated chassis, misaligned priorities, and a declining sense of what buyers wanted. It lives on today, mostly in junkyard legends and rusted-out husks occasionally spotted at derelict farms where it waits, appropriately enough, for a rebirth that never came. The 1965 Chevrolet Corvair Corsa Turbo was perhaps the most misunderstood and most dangerous evolution of a car already steeped in controversy. By the time this high-performance variant arrived, the Corvair had already been tarnished by Ralph Nader's expose, "Unsafe at Any Speed," which harshly criticized the early model's swing-axle rear suspension for its unpredictable handling and dangerous tendency to lift and tuck wheels mid-corner. General Motors, under immense pressure, redesigned the suspension in 1965, ditching the swing axle for a fully independent setup more akin to the Corvette's. But for the Corsa Turbo, it wasn't enough to change the car's fate. Under the rear deck lid was a turbocharged version of Chevy's air-cooled flat six, displacing 164 cubic inches and pushing 180 horsepower. An impressive number for a compact in 1970. It was America's first production turbocharged car, coming just before the Oldsmobile Jetfire and foreshadowing decades of boost-happy performance. On paper, the Corsa Turbo had it all: a sleek, almost European body, a 4-speed manual transmission, and performance figures that could challenge early Mustangs and GTOs in a straight line. But the devil was in the details. That turbo setup, crude by today's standards, relied on a draw-through carburetor layout with no intercooler and no wastegate. The result was massive turbo lag followed by abrupt, unmanageable surges of boost that arrived like a sledgehammer. The Corsa Turbo had no modern engine management, no knock sensors, and no way of smoothing out its sudden, peaky power delivery. This made it a nightmare for the average American driver used to smooth V8s or low-revving inline sixes. One second you'd be coaxing it along in traffic, the next you were wrestling with a wave of boost, the rear end breaking loose as the weight shifted unpredictably over that tail-heavy rear-engine chassis. And though GM had improved the suspension, the physics of a rear-engine layout with an air-cooled motor still worked against the Corvair. Weight distribution hovered around 60-40 rear biased, and while that could offer traction under acceleration, it also made the car deeply unforgiving at the limit. If you let off the throttle mid-corner, especially during a panic response, the back end could still swing out suddenly. Lift throttle oversteer wasn't just a theoretical hazard. It was a very real risk that many average drivers didn't know how to anticipate, much less correct. Unlike a Porsche 911 of the same era, which had years of race-bred engineering and a cult of mechanically inclined enthusiasts to support it, the Corvair was bought by mainstream Americans, commuters, retirees, young families. Most of them had no idea how to handle a sudden rear breakaway at 60 miles per hour. The car required finesse and anticipation, skills not taught at most driving schools in the 60s. Inside, the Corsa Turbo offered sporty bucket seats, a full dash of gauge, and even a tachometer, but safety features were minimal. Lap belts were optional, not standard. There were no crumple zones, no side impact protection, and the steering column wasn't collapsible. At high speeds, the lightweight construction of the Corvair didn't inspire confidence, especially with the added power of the turbo engine. And then there was the heat, or lack thereof. Being air-cooled, the Corvair had a notoriously inefficient heating system, pulling warm air from around the engine shrouds, often laced with oil fumes, and piping it into the cabin. On cold mornings, the driver had to choose between breathing noxious vapor or freezing. Maintenance on the turbo models was another headache. The turbo units were delicate and finicky, prone to carbon buildup and oil leakage, and the carburetor setup required frequent tuning. Many mechanics weren't familiar with forced induction, leading to botched repairs or improperly adjusted fuel-air ratios that worsened the car's already uneven performance. And yet, the Corsa Turbo had charm, almost too much. When driven by someone who understood its quirks, it was quick, agile, and completely unlike anything else on American roads. Enthusiasts compared it to European sports cars, and in capable hands, it could run with the best of them. It had flair, attitude, and one of the most distinct silhouettes of the 1960s. Jay Leno famously called the late model Corvairs the American Porsche, a compliment, albeit with an asterisk. But for the average American buyer in 1965, especially those spooked by early reports of instability and wary of turbocharging's unfamiliar quirks, the Corsa Turbo was too much car wrapped in the wrong package. It was fast and exciting, but dangerous in the hands of the unprepared. With the rise of simpler, front-engine pony cars like the Mustang and the lingering PR damage from Nader's book, the Corvair's days were numbered. The 1975 Mercury Bobcat was Mercury's ill-fated attempt to gentrify one of the most infamously flawed compact cars in American history, the Ford Pinto. By the time the Bobcat was introduced, the Pinto's explosive rear-end collision issues were already public knowledge, thanks to internal Ford memos and media reports that exposed the company's cost-cutting decisions. Rather than redesign or improve the platform significantly, Mercury chose a simpler path. Dress it up with chrome trim, fake wood grain panels, and plusher upholstery, then slap on a new badge and hope buyers wouldn't notice. But they did, and the result was one of the most transparent exercises in automotive badge engineering ever seen in the 1970s. At its core, the Bobcat was the same Pinto underneath, built on the same chassis, with the same engineering shortcuts that made the original notorious. The fuel tank still sat precariously close to the rear bumper with insufficient protection. The engine lineup was just as uninspired, a base 1.6-liter four-cylinder that wheezed out around 75 horsepower, or the optional 2.3-liter four that barely improved performance. Mated to either a sloppy four-speed manual or a dull three-speed automatic, the Bobcat couldn't accelerate with confidence, climb hills without gasping, or merge onto freeways without panic. But it was the false promises that made the Bobcat even more disappointing. Mercury positioned it as a more upscale alternative to the Pinto, targeting young professionals, urban singles, and families looking for economy without sacrificing style. So it got a waterfall grille, extra chrome on the bumpers, faux wood on the dash, and optional plush carpeting. But these changes were purely cosmetic. Underneath the badge and tinsel was still a rattling, thinly built car prone to rust, with squeaky suspension and doors that closed with a tinny clang instead of a reassuring thunk. The Bobcat's cabin may have looked more refined than the Pinto's, but it didn't feel it. The seats were uncomfortable, the dashboard warped under heat, and the fake wood grain peeled within a couple of years. Despite Mercury's attempt to market it as more mature, the driving experience was still jarring and noisy. Road and wind noise were ever present, ride quality was choppy, and the car had all the structural rigidity of a cereal box. And then there was safety, or the lack thereof. Though by 1975 Ford had begun to implement some revisions to the fuel tank shielding, the Bobcat remained deeply tied to the Pinto's dangerous legacy. Many buyers simply didn't trust it, and the Mercury name did little to shake off the stink of controversy. In the event of a rear-end collision, even my low-speed impacts could result in fuel spillage, or worse, despite minimal updates. The public perception was cemented. The Bobcat was just a Pinto in a velvet blazer, and just as dangerous. Meanwhile, the competition had already passed it by. Toyota's Corolla and VW's Rabbit, white Golf in Europe, were not only safer and better engineered, they also offered tighter handling, more reliability, and higher resale value. These imports felt solid, efficient, and surprisingly fun to drive. Qualities the Bobcat could only dream of. American buyers were waking up to the idea that small didn't have to mean cheap, and the Bobcat represented the exact opposite. A cynical, low-effort repackaging of a flawed design at a time when the market was demanding more. Sales were never impressive, and by the end of the decade, the Bobcat was gone. Mercury's small car experiment quietly ended with barely a whimper as buyers fled the showroom for better-built imports. Today, the Mercury Bobcat is barely remembered, even by Mercury enthusiasts. It's become a cautionary tale in brand dilution, a sad example of what happens when marketing tries to paper over engineering failures with chrome and vinyl. In hindsight, the 1975 Mercury Bobcat stands as one of the more tragic efforts of the malaise era. Not because it was uniquely bad, but because it was so transparently derivative, so desperately dressed up, and so clearly not what the public wanted. It didn't just fail to deliver on its promises, it made those promises feel like a joke. And in the cynical, smog-choked haze of the 1970s, that made it the perfect symbol of a company that had lost touch with its customers. The 1968 AMC Rebel SST was one of those cars that seemed, at first glance, to be keeping pace with the muscle luxury craze sweeping across American highways. But in truth, it was the automotive equivalent of a cover band trying to crash the stage at Woodstock. It wasn't without merit, but it was late to the party, underfinanced, and working with aging equipment in a year when flash and fury were everything. What AMC tried to do with the Rebel SST was admirable. Take a conservative midsize platform and give it enough muscle, chrome, and attitude to stand alongside titans like the Chevrolet Chevelle SS396, Ford Torino GT, and Plymouth GTX. But what they actually delivered was a strange cocktail of decent engineering, dated design, and corporate desperation, and very little of it aged well. At its core, the Rebel SST was the halo trim for AMC's midsize line in 1968, positioned as a performance luxury hybrid for families who wanted comfort and muscle in the same driveway. Styling-wise, it wasn't unattractive, especially compared to AMC's earlier bathtub designs. The SST had clean, squared-off lines, a long hood, and a purposeful stance. Available in coupe, sedan, convertible, and wagon form, it looked like a competitor. The problem was that it only pretended to be one. AMC spent more time on badging and fake wood grain than on performance development. Under the hood, buyers could select from a range of engines, from the anemic 232 inline 6 all the way up to the 343 and 390 V8s, with the latter producing a respectable 315 horsepower. The Rebel SST, with the 390 and a 4-barrel carb, was actually a quick car by period standards. But it came with caveats: manual drum brakes unless you paid extra, vague recirculating ball steering with lots of play, and a suspension that floated over bumps like an old mattress spring. You could option it up, sure, but even with power discs and HD suspension, it never felt tight or eager. It was big, soft, and slow to react. The car's 3-speed automatic, AMC's version of the Borg-Warner M8, was smooth but lazy, and by the time it kicked down for a passing move, the moment had often passed. Inside, the SST trim added what AMC called luxury appointments, which included high-back bucket seats, a center console, optional, wood-look accents, and SST-specific badging. But quality control was AMC's Achilles heel. The seats might look sharp, but the foam broke down early. Door panels warped, and chrome trim was prone to flaking. The dash plastics cracked in the sun, and many of the knobs and switchgear felt like they were pulled from an appliance parts bin. Even the steering wheel had a tendency to crack at the rim after a few hot summers. And then there was AMC's real problem: reputation. In the late 1960s, the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, were in a horsepower war, and dealers were flooded with fire-breathing coupes that could run the quarter mile in 14 seconds or less. AMC didn't have the money to compete on that level, and it showed. Their cars were good in concept, but constantly hamstrung by a lack of refinement and a general sense that AMC was the budget brand, the car you bought if you couldn't afford a Chevelle or a Mustang. The Rebel SST tried to shift that image, but one look at the underbody told the truth. Aging platforms, narrow wheel tracks, and very little development in areas like noise insulation, suspension tuning, or structural rigidity. The Rebel's X-frame construction lacked the strength of newer perimeter frames used by Ford and GM. AMC had stuck with it for cost reasons, and it resulted in flex underload, especially in hard cornering or aggressive braking. Owners reported creaking, popping, and even alignment issues as early as 10,000 miles, especially in rust-prone northern states where AMC's minimal rust proofing became a major liability. Combine that with spotty dealer support and increasingly competitive imports from Japan, and the SST's fate was sealed. Then there was the fact that AMC itself was going through an identity crisis. The company didn't know if it wanted to be a volume player, a muscle car brand, or a purveyor of practical compact cars. The SST tried to be too many things at once, and it didn't excel at any of them. It wasn't powerful enough to earn true muscle car status. It wasn't refined enough to be a true luxury car, and it lacked the reliability and polish of rising imports like the Toyota Corona or Datsun 510, which were winning over a younger, more cost-conscious generation of buyers who had grown weary of Detroit's chrome and vinyl promises. Production of the 1968 Rebel SST was modest, and collector interest today is nearly non-existent. You'll rarely see one at car shows unless it belongs to a hardcore AMC enthusiast or has been turned into a resto mod. Parts are hard to find, documentation is spotty, and resale value is a shadow of its big three counterparts. The 1976 Buick Skyhawk was one of those cars that seemed to have everything going for it, on paper. Compact, rear-wheel drive, V6 power, hatchback practicality, and the prestige of a Buick badge in a shrinking car segment. It was meant to be GM's answer to the increasingly dominant Japanese imports, especially sporty compacts like the Mazda RX-3 and Toyota Celica, both of which were winning over American buyers with their sharp styling, eager performance, and tight build quality. But what GM delivered instead, with the Skyhawk, was a lesson in corporate compromise, undercooked engineering, and badge-based marketing. The Skyhawk was built on the infamous H-body platform, which it shared with the Chevrolet Monza, Pontiac Sunbird, and Oldsmobile Starfire. GM had originally planned to offer these H-bodies with a Wankel rotary engine, but after reliability issues, emissions nightmares, and fuel economy concerns, the plan was scrapped at the 11th hour. In its place, GM rushed to adapt existing power plants, and for Buick, that meant the 231 cubic inch, 3.8-liter V6, a torquey but crude engine with rough idle, weak refinement, and noticeable vibration. It was basically a chopped-down Buick 350 V8 with two cylinders lopped off and minimal rebalancing. When the Skyhawk hit the market, it was promoted as the sporty luxury compact coupe. What that meant in reality was a sharply raked hatchback design with Buick's signature waterfall grille glued onto the nose and a vinyl-trimmed interior that looked better than it felt. Inside, you got bucket seats, extra gauges, some fake wood grain, and carpeted surfaces. But it didn't take long before squeaks, rattles, and dash vibration reminded you this was still a cheaply built compact dressed up to look expensive. The seat tracks were known to bind. The doors creaked. The hatchback leaked in heavy rain. The foam in the seats broke down early. Buick tried to give it class, but it had none. Driving the Skyhawk was equally disappointing. The 3.8 V6 made around 110 horsepower, not terrible for the time, but it was saddled with poor gearing, a vague shifting 3-speed automatic, or an awkward 4-speed manual, and a soft suspension setup that couldn't handle curves with any enthusiasm. GM had tuned it more for comfort than control, which in a car with such a short wheelbase and hatchback weight distribution made for some truly unsettling handling quirks. The car understeered on entry, leaned like a sailboat mid-corner, and over bumps it pogoed like a rubber raft. The rear suspension was a primitive live axle with coil springs, and though GM had tried to fine-tune it, the result was neither sporty nor stable. Torque steer was a regular complaint, especially with the manual version, and the brakes, front discs, and rear drums were underwhelming even by mid-70s standards. Road tests at the time often noted long stopping distances and brake fade under repeated hard use. And then there was the build quality, inconsistent panel gaps, misaligned trim, cheap plastics, and a tendency for rust to appear within just a few winters, especially in the wheel wells and rocker panels. But what really killed the Skyhawk wasn't just its dynamic flaws, it was the competition. By 1990, Japanese automakers had cracked the American compact code. The Toyota Celica was stylish, nimble, and bulletproof. The Mazda RX-3 was lighter, faster, and far more engaging to drive, despite its wankel rotary quirks. Both were better built, more fuel efficient, and far more fun. Against those, the Skyhawk looked like a lazy attempt to cash in on a trend without doing the work. Even within GM's own lineup, the Skyhawk felt redundant. The Chevy Monza offered essentially the same platform with more youthful appeal. The Pontiac Sunbird leaned sportier. The old Starfire was a strange middle ground. Buick's attempt to set the Skyhawk apart with luxury touches just didn't resonate. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't sporty, and it certainly wasn't reliable. Worse, its price tag hovered dangerously close to better-built imports. And even the base V6 models were outclassed in refinement and reliability by four-cylinder Toyotas and Hondas, which cost less and lasted longer. Owners at the time were frustrated. Period complaints ranged from engine stalling to electrical issues to constant rattles. The fuel economy wasn't even good, averaging just 1620 mpg in the real world, despite being pitched as a gas-saving import fighter. And while Buick would continue to evolve the Skyhawk nameplate into the 1980s, eventually rebadging Opel-derived models, the original H-body Skyhawk was quietly forgotten. Today, very few survive. The build quality ensured most rusted away by the late 1980s, and collectors have shown little interest in reviving them. It's rare to see one even at a junkyard meet. Most are remembered only in passing, by mechanics who hated working on them and owners who regret buying one. The 1974 Chevrolet Nova, part of the fourth generation that ran from 1973 to 1979, marked a sharp decline in what had once been a respected compact car that balanced performance, style, and affordability. By the mid-70s, the Nova had become sadly more famous for its shortcomings than its strengths, a symbol of GM's aggressive cost-cutting and a fading muscle car era that was more about marketing than engineering excellence. Once a darling of youthful drivers and budget-conscious buyers seeking a sporty compact, the Nova's fourth generation arrived during an era marked by rising emissions regulations, soaring insurance rates, and a growing flood of Japanese and European imports redefining what an affordable compact car could be. The 1974 model year stood out in particular as it inherited a heavy, bloated chassis and outdated suspension design that made for a rough, noisy ride that undermined the Nova's legacy. From the moment you climbed into the 1974 Nova, the evidence of corner cutting was everywhere. The interior materials felt thin and cheap, with hard plastics, peeling vinyl, and seats that offered minimal support even on short trips. The fit and finish were notoriously inconsistent. Panel gaps were uneven, interior trim rattled incessantly, and the dashboard seemed designed more for cost efficiency than driver comfort. Those rattles and squeaks were a constant reminder that GM had put profit margins ahead of quality control. Under the hood, the Nova retained the option of the venerable small-block V8 engines, but power was curtailed significantly compared to earlier years due to emissions mandates and lower compression ratios. The once celebrated muscle-oriented performance was replaced by a much tamer, less engaging driving experience. Base models came with a sluggish inline-six, which struggled to move the car's now heavier frame, and even the V8 options, while still decent on paper, felt lethargic and muffled in real-world driving. The suspension setup was a harsh reminder that this was no longer a car built for enthusiasm. The Nova's leaf springs at the rear were archaic and contributed to a jarring ride over anything less than perfect pavement. Handling was sloppy and uninspiring, with body roll that undermined confidence and a vague, numb steering system that sapped any connection between driver and road. Noise intrusion was high. Road and engine noise invaded the cabin freely, turning highway cruising into a tiring affair. Rust was another cruel reality for Nova owners. GM's corrosion protection measures in 1974 were minimal at best. Areas like the wheel wells, floor pans, and rocker panels were prone to rust after just 1 or 2 winters in harsh climates. This susceptibility to rust was a major factor in the rapid decline of used Novas on the road, as it left many owners with costly repair bills or forced them to scrap their cars early. Even law enforcement agencies, once loyal to the Nova for its simplicity and ruggedness, began phasing them out. Police departments criticized the car for poor durability, low performance in pursuit situations, and unreliable components. The Nova simply couldn't keep up with the demands of rigorous duty use, and police fleets shifted toward more capable and dependable alternatives. Compared to the Japanese imports flooding the American market, cars like the Toyota Corolla and Datsun 510, the Nova felt ancient. These imports offered quieter, smoother rides, better fuel economy, improved build quality, and a driving experience that felt more refined and modern. For many buyers in the mid-70s, the Nova represented the worst of the American auto industry, a brand that had once thrived but was now resting on past glories, unwilling or unable to innovate. Despite its poor reputation, the 1974 Nova had its loyalists. Some appreciated its straightforward mechanics, the ease of repair, and the sheer ubiquity of parts. The car was affordable, easy to work on, and could be modified into a basic muscle car with aftermarket upgrades, preserving some of its youthful appeal in certain circles. Yet, these fans were a shrinking minority as the automotive landscape rapidly changed. In hindsight, the 1974 Chevrolet Nova is remembered as a cautionary tale of American automaking during the malaise era, a car that symbolized lost opportunity, diminishing quality, and a brand outpaced by global competition. Where once the Nova had stood as a promising compact muscle car, by 1974, it had become a relic weighed down by cost-cutting, indifferent design, and an industry struggling to redefine itself. Its legacy is a reminder of how quickly innovation can stall and how harsh the marketplace can be for those unwilling to evolve. The 1963 Mercury Comet S22 arrived at a time when the American compact car market was just beginning to evolve. Mercury, known for its upscale positioning within the Ford Motor Company lineup, hoped to capture a niche by offering something sportier and more refined than the base Ford Falcon, on which the Comet was largely based. The idea was to appeal to buyers who wanted a compact car without sacrificing the prestige and perceived quality that came with a Mercury badge. But while the exterior styling, with its sleek lines and distinct badging, promised a step up in sophistication, the reality of the Comet S22's design and engineering quickly undermined those aspirations. Underneath its slightly more polished appearance, the Comet was essentially a Falcon in a tuxedo. The chassis and suspension were carried over without significant upgrades, resulting in handling that was soft, imprecise, and frankly uninspiring. The suspension tuning was more focused on comfort than on sporty driving, which meant excessive body roll in corners and a lack of feedback through the steering wheel. This made the car feel vague and disconnected from the road, disappointing drivers who expected the S22 trim to offer something livelier. The vague, rubbery feel of the steering, paired with the car's relatively heavy weight, made quick maneuvers difficult and nerve-wracking for anyone hoping for spirited driving. Another major drawback was the persistent vibration and noise issues. Many owners reported engine and drivetrain vibrations that were transmitted directly into the cabin, making longer drives fatiguing and uncomfortable. This was worsened by poor sound insulation and thin door seals, which allowed wind and road noise to penetrate aggressively. Water leaks around doors and windows were also a common complaint, damaging interior trim and contributing to a sense of cheapness and poor craftsmanship. For a brand like Mercury that sought to project a premium image, these issues were a significant blow to customer satisfaction. The interior itself, while a step up from the Falcons, was underwhelming by any standards. Materials felt cheap and fragile. Hard plastics, basic cloth upholstery, and thin, rattly panels contributed to a cabin that was noisy and uncomfortable. The promised upscale touches did little to mask the underlying budget construction. The car's ergonomics and layout felt basic, with no real innovations or comforts that would justify the price premium over the Falcon. This disconnect between Mercury's marketing and the actual user experience left many owners feeling they'd overpaid for an uninspiring product. Performance was another area where the Comet S22 fell short. The car was offered with a choice of engines, including a modest inline-six and a small block V8, but neither was truly exciting. The six-cylinder provided only basic, adequate power, while the V8, though more powerful, was hampered by the car's weight and lack of chassis refinement. Acceleration was slow by muscle car or even sporty compact standards, and the car struggled to keep up with more modern, lighter competitors from Japan and Europe. The suspension and brakes were not up to the task of controlling the car's power, making spirited driving feel unsafe or reckless. In terms of reliability and quality control, the Comet was plagued by inconsistency. Buyers frequently encountered issues with fit and finish, mechanical gremlins, and general build quality that did not inspire confidence. Maintenance costs tended to be higher than expected for a compact car, and many customers found themselves facing frustrating trips to the dealer early in the ownership cycle. In contrast, imports like the Honda Civic, introduced just a few years later, prioritized simple, robust engineering and reliable performance, quickly building a reputation for dependability that the Comet simply could not match. The Comet's marketing struggled to clearly define its target audience. It wasn't quite sporty enough to appeal to muscle car fans, nor refined enough to attract luxury buyers. This middle-of-the-road positioning, combined with the car's shortcomings, led to poor sales and limited appeal. The car became a forgotten footnote in Mercury's history, overshadowed by competitors who better understood and executed what compact car buyers wanted. Ultimately, the 1963 Mercury Comet S22 serves as a cautionary tale of a brand trying to bridge two very different markets, economy and luxury, without fully committing to either. It looked the part of a premium, sporty compact, but failed to deliver the handling, performance, quality, and reliability that would make it desirable. In a period of rapid automotive innovation, where foreign manufacturers were beginning to redefine consumer expectations, the Comet's shortcomings were glaring. It was, in many ways, a symbol of American automakers' struggle to adapt. The 1973 Pontiac Grand Am, the very first generation of a model meant to carve out a unique niche, was Pontiac's bold but flawed attempt to blend sportiness with luxury, trying to emulate the refined, European-style Grand Touring cars that were gaining respect and popularity across the Atlantic. Pontiac wanted the Grand Am to be their answer to BMW's and Mercedes-Benz models, a sophisticated machine that offered both aggressive styling and comfort. On paper, the idea was promising. A personal luxury coupe with a more European flavor, distinct from Pontiac's typical muscle cars. But in reality, the first-gen Grand Am was a confusing mix of compromises that delivered very little of what it promised. Underneath its sleek bodywork and luxury sport marketing, the Grand Am shared many components with the aging Pontiac GTO and other intermediate GM models, including the platform and many mechanical bits. This resulted in a car that was heavy and bloated, without the nimbleness or engineering finesse to back up its sporty aspirations. The suspension was soft and unrefined, which meant that the car wallowed over corners rather than gripping the road with precision. The handling was more boat-like than agile, leaving drivers wishing for sharper steering and tighter control that European competitors offered as standard. One of the biggest strikes against the Grand Am was its build quality. Fit and finish were inconsistent at best, with creaking panels, rattling interior trim, and doors that never quite seemed to close firmly. Inside, the interior aimed for luxury but delivered a lackluster experience, featuring cheap plastics, poorly aligned dashboard components, and upholstery that lacked durability and flair. The promised upscale ambiance was undercut by these quality issues, and the cabin failed to deliver the quiet, refined environment that buyers expected from a car marketed as a luxury sport coupe. Performance, once a Pontiac hallmark, took a hit with the Grand Am's launch during the early 1970s emissions crackdown. The muscle car era was already fading, and the Grand Am's V8 engines were detuned to meet strict federal regulations, causing significant power loss. The excitement and aggressive acceleration that had defined Pontiac's previous performance cars were nowhere to be found here. Instead, the Grand Am's engine felt strained and sluggish, unable to offer the thrilling driving experience that had once made Pontiac's muscle cars so popular. This disconnect left many enthusiasts frustrated and disappointed. Mechanically, the car suffered from typical early 70s GM reliability problems. Electrical gremlins, transmission issues, and suspension wear plagued owners. The car's complexity, intended to boost its luxury credentials, often translated into difficult and costly repairs. Maintenance was neither simple nor affordable, which further soured ownership experiences and added to the Grand Am's reputation as an unreliable choice compared to well-built European imports or even some Japanese competitors entering the market. Marketing the Grand Am proved equally problematic. Pontiac struggled to clearly define what the car was supposed to be. Was it a sporty coupe with luxury touches? A personal luxury car with performance leanings? The mixed messaging confused buyers. Loyal Pontiac muscle car fans weren't interested in a luxury model that couldn't perform, while upscale buyers looking for European-style refinement and precision naturally gravitated toward the real BMWs and Mercedes-Benz models that offered genuine engineering excellence, reliability, and prestige. The Grand Am fell into a frustrating middle ground, pleasing no one. As a result, the first-generation Grand Am sold poorly and quickly faded into obscurity. Pontiac discontinued the model after just a few years, having learned that creating a Euro-style luxury sport car was far more complicated than simply slapping together performance and comfort features on an existing muscle car platform. The Grand Am of 1973 became a cautionary example of Detroit's struggle to adapt to shifting market tastes and tightening regulations in the 1970s, a car caught between eras, unable to satisfy muscle car fans or luxury buyers, ultimately overshadowed by stronger competitors both domestic and foreign. In retrospect, the 1973 Pontiac Grand Am is a fascinating relic of a transitional moment in automotive history. It captures the ambition and challenges of American manufacturers attempting to reinvent themselves as consumer demands changed. Yet, its rattly build, lackluster performance, and confused identity make it a model best remembered as an interesting experiment that fell short rather than a success story. Those who find one today usually see it as a quirky, oddball classic, one that tried to be many things but ended up being a bit of a mess, lost in the shadow of true luxury and performance icons. The 1970 Ford Maverick arrived in the American market as Ford's hurried response to the rising wave of compact, fuel-efficient imports flooding the U.S. car scene, namely the Volkswagen Beetle and the Japanese newcomers like the Toyota Corolla and Datsun 510. The Maverick was intended to be Ford's answer to this challenge, a domestic compact car that could offer buyers a smaller footprint, better gas mileage, and a budget-friendly price. But the Maverick was rushed into production, and unfortunately, that haste showed in nearly every aspect of the car. Mechanically, the Maverick was built on the bones of the old Ford Falcon platform, which dated back to the late 1950s. While the Falcon had been a reliable and affordable car for its time, by 1970, its architecture was clearly outdated. The Maverick inherited these underpinnings with minimal modernization, which meant the chassis and suspension were neither particularly refined nor capable of providing a smooth, modern ride. The ride quality was often harsh, with little damping on rough roads, and the car's handling was uninspiring at best, feeling loose and sometimes unsettled in corners. There was no sense of sportiness or nimbleness that the imports were earning their reputations for, and instead the Maverick felt ponderous and somewhat sloppy behind the wheel. Under the hood, the Maverick's engine options didn't inspire much confidence. The base engine was a 170 cubic inch inline six, which was underpowered and struggled to move the car efficiently, especially with multiple passengers or cargo. While Ford did offer a 200 cubic inch six and a few V8 options, notably the 302 small block, even these engines were known to run hot, especially in stop-and-go traffic or during summer heat. The cooling systems were marginal at best, and the engines emitted a loud, rough soundtrack, nothing like the smooth, quiet operation Japanese engines were beginning to offer. The combination of noise, heat, and mechanical roughness made the Maverick feel more like a rugged workhorse than a comfortable commuter car. Inside, the Maverick's interior was a stark disappointment. Materials were cheap and thin, the dashboard was basic and uninspired, and many of the controls felt flimsy and poorly fitted. Seats were hard and uncomfortable for long drives, and cabin insulation was minimal, allowing engine noise, road noise, and vibrations to intrude heavily into the passenger space. Even basic conveniences were often missing or poorly implemented, which made the driving experience feel raw and unrefined. Qualities that contrasted sharply with the rising expectations set by imports, which emphasized ergonomics, comfort, and thoughtful design. Build quality was another significant flaw. The Maverick suffered from inconsistent assembly and lackluster finishing. Panel gaps were uneven, paint quality was variable, and trim pieces often rattled or loosened over time. Rust resistance was also mediocre, which meant that many Mavericks deteriorated quickly, especially in regions with harsh winters and salted roads. Owners often found themselves dealing with squeaks, rattles, and premature wear that made the car feel cheaply made and short-lived. Beyond the tangible mechanical and build issues, the Maverick's design and marketing failed to connect emotionally with buyers. The styling was bland and uninspired, especially compared to the quirky charm of the VW Beetle or the sharp practical designs emerging from Japan. Ford tried to position the Maverick as a youthful, affordable compact, but its compromises made it feel more like a stopgap product than a genuine alternative. Advertisements touted its economy and price, but didn't address its many shortcomings, leading to consumer disappointment when the car failed to deliver on comfort, refinement, and reliability. Ironically, rather than standing up to imports, the Maverick often had the opposite effect, making foreign competitors look smarter and more modern by comparison. Buyers who wanted a practical, reliable, and economical compact car frequently chose the Japanese or European alternatives instead, recognizing their superior engineering, build quality, and driving experience. The Maverick, while not a complete failure and eventually finding some niche as a budget cruiser, couldn't shake the stigma of being an outdated, rushed, and compromised vehicle. In the broader context of automotive history, the 1970 Ford Maverick represents Detroit's uneasy attempt to catch up with a rapidly evolving market it had largely ignored for years. It shows how the Big Three struggled to adapt their old designs to new consumer demands and how hastily executed responses often backfired. Today, the Maverick is remembered as a relic of that transitional period, a car with good intentions but flawed execution that, more often than not, made the imports look like a much smarter, more thoughtful choice for everyday drivers. The 1962 Dodge Dart's transformation from a full-size car to a downsized B-body vehicle was a bold but ultimately misguided gamble that reflected both the shifting tides of the American automotive landscape and Dodge's internal struggles to adapt quickly enough. This change came at a time when Detroit was beginning to recognize the growing importance of smaller cars, especially in response to increasing urbanization, rising fuel concerns, and the steady infiltration of European and Japanese imports, offering compact, efficient alternatives. Yet, Dodge's execution of the Dart's downsizing was hampered by a confused vision, poor timing, and a market that wasn't fully ready to embrace the vehicle as it was presented. Before 1962, the Dodge Dart had earned a reputation as a respectable, full-size car, catering to middle-class families looking for a solid, roomy vehicle with decent performance and comfort. Dodge buyers expected cars that felt substantial, large cabins, smooth rides, and powerful engines that fit the American car culture's love of size and strength. When Dodge abruptly shifted the Dart onto the smaller B-body platform, it disrupted those expectations in a jarring way. The 1962 Dart was significantly smaller, yet it carried styling and engineering compromises that failed to satisfy either the old full-size loyalists or the emerging compact-minded buyers. Styling-wise, the 62 Dart seemed to lack cohesion and personality. The design language was safe and somewhat uninspired, featuring boxy, angular lines that gave it a stumpy, almost awkward silhouette. This was not the sleek, futuristic shape buyers were starting to gravitate toward, nor was it bold enough to command attention or respect on the road. Compared to the previous Dart's more substantial proportions, the new model felt like a car that had been scaled down without a clear sense of identity, neither a sharp, compact sportster nor a confident midsize sedan. Inside, the problems continued. The interior was basic and utilitarian, with minimal attention to ergonomics or style. Hard plastics and simple trims dominated the cabin, giving the driver and passengers little sense of refinement or comfort. Dodge offered limited options for customization or upgrade, so the Dart was often perceived as a bare-bones vehicle, especially when compared to the increasingly well-appointed offerings from competitors. This austerity worked against Dodge in a period when buyers were becoming more discerning and interested in not just utility, but also the feel of quality and craftsmanship. Performance was another area where the 1962 Dart struggled to impress. While it did come with a respectable range of engines for its class, including six-cylinder and V8 options, none were particularly exciting or groundbreaking. The power-to-weight ratio was modest, and the Dart's handling reflected its platform origins. Not terrible, but far from inspiring. Its suspension and chassis tuning were basic, with underwhelming ride quality and limited cornering ability, making it a forgettable driver's car in an era when many competitors were beginning to emphasize sportiness and driving dynamics. The biggest issue, however, was market perception. Dodge's loyal customers had been conditioned to expect larger, more commanding vehicles that made a statement. The sudden shift to a smaller, somewhat plain and awkward model was a shock that left many feeling betrayed or confused. Dealers were caught in the middle trying to sell a car that lacked the muscle and stature Dodge was known for, to buyers who weren't yet convinced that downsizing was the future. At the same time, the competition was heating up. European imports like the Volkswagen Beetle were gaining traction, offering affordable, reliable, and genuinely practical transportation that suited urban environments better than the American cars of the time. Meanwhile, Japanese brands such as Toyota and Datsun were making their initial inroads, bringing fresh styling, better fuel economy, and a reputation for long-term durability. These imports felt modern and purpose-built for the changing needs of American drivers, and they exposed the Dodge Dart's weaknesses more starkly. The Dart's failure to connect with the market also highlighted a broader issue in Detroit's approach to downsizing and compact cars. Instead of designing a new car from the ground up for this emerging segment, Dodge essentially shrank an existing platform and compromised on style, comfort, and performance. This patchwork solution could not compete with purpose-built imports or even other American manufacturers that took more deliberate approaches to creating compact or mid-size cars. Moreover, the Dart's launch coincided with a cultural and economic moment in America that demanded new thinking. Urban sprawl, shifting commuting patterns, and an evolving middle class began to prioritize efficiency and affordability over sheer size.